Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is another Ukraine war update, a walk through the front lines. First thing to note is that, rather like yesterday, there's not a lot of movement on the front lines. This might partly be due to operational security reasons of keeping the front lines, particularly where they are most hotly contested, free from media intrusion. There are media blackouts, information blackouts, so it's difficult to find out exactly what's going on, particularly in Kherson, in the Kherson Oblast region, down here where there is that very attritional front line, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Not so sure about up here, whether there's just not a lot of movement due to, again, reconstituting forces on both sides. Ukraine made that really lightning quick advance, and they are now sort of taking a breather, making sure that they've got the right resources and the right logistics in place. However, it must be noted that there is, this squeeze going on with Ukraine pushing up north from the Seversky Donetsk River and a little bit eastwards along the Oskil, certainly down at the bottom. As you can see from this map by War Mapper, there are these yellow areas which show that the Russians are being pushed out of areas. And this pink area is increasing in size, which is a forward operating area for the Russians. It generally means that they don't have a secure control over those areas as, say, these very much occupied areas in red. I was watching Sky News it might have been 2 days ago now, that they said that Ukraine had control of this road, right, between Starobilsk and Svatove. Now, I can't see any confirmation of this, and that would be incredible, because this settlement here, Starobilsk, is a transport hub, it's a logistical hub. And that is going to be one of the main objectives going forward, I would have thought, up here for the Ukrainians, because that will really hit the Russians' logistics, feeding from Russia down into the Donbass. So I'm sure that's going to be one of the objectives. However, I can't see any confirmation that they've even got fire control, or that they're even up there. Because realistically, they're still fighting over Kupiansk. So Kupiansk sits on the Oskil River, but it is separated into. So we'll see up here that Kupiansk there, part of it sits on the east of the river and part of it on the west. And then you get these sort of other settlements satellite settlements around it. Now, what we do know is that Ukraine now control the east of Kupiansk. Okay, so there have been geolocations of the Ukrainian troops here and actually seizing some equipment that the Russians have left behind in this part of Kupiansk. So they definitely control both the east and the west of Kupiansk now. So that is a bit of movement, and there is some rumor to say that the Ukrainians have managed to get across on the east-hand side, so the left-hand side of the river, because the river is flowing this way, at Borova. So this is what the Institute for the Study of War is saying. So Russian sources claim that Ukrainian forces have crossed the Oskil River near Borova on September the 13th. So that's a good few days ago. I haven't heard much or anything since then, really. But certainly Kupiansk is now fully in Ukrainian hands. And as we can see around here, there are, so Studenok and Sosnove are now in Ukrainian hands. These settlements for War Mapper that are yellow with a little red ring around them mean they are still, they're not quite in Ukrainian hands, but they are being contested. The Ukrainians are making advances in this area, but it is slow going. The Russians have greater defensive capabilities, and they're not caught off guard now, if you like. but not a great amount of movement compared to what we saw from the week before. And it's, again, I'm going to say the same thing as yesterday. We're just going to have to wait and see what the decisions are. I'm fairly sure that the Ukrainians will be taking Svadove and Starobilsk, because these are really important transport hubs. Now, what the Ukrainians are also doing is attacking areas north of the border into Russia. And this is because Russia hit Ukraine with rockets and artillery from within the Russian territory. I'm going to read you some reaction from good old Vladimir Putin, and this is from the Institute for the Study of War, but reporting what he said publicly. And I talked before about how Russia hit electricity infrastructure and the dam in Kryvyi Rih as a retaliation for a lack of negotiations on account of the Ukrainians refusing to negotiate with the Russians. But what Putin is saying is that these appear to be, and again, take what he says with a pinch of salt, but these appear to be retaliations for the Ukrainians hitting equipment and bases inside of Russia. So, and this is a quote from the ISW, Putin said that Russia has been, quote, rather restrained in our response, that's what Putin has said, to Ukrainian, quote, terrorist acts and attempts to damage our civilian infrastructure. In a question and answer session with reporters following the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting on September 16th. He continued, quote, more recently, the Russian armed forces have dealt a couple of sensitive blows. So that's going to be your Kryvyi Rih and the electricity infrastructure. That are, quote, warning shots, and threatened that more serious attacks could follow. Putin did not explicitly refer to the reported Ukrainian strikes on the base of the Russian 3rd Motorized Rifle Division near Valyuky that occurred on September 16th, nor did he make clear which Russian actions he was referring to. But Russian forces have increased attacks on civilian infrastructure throughout Ukraine over the past several weeks as Russian media personalities increase explicit calls for such attacks. Okay, so this is basically pundits on TV saying, you know, we can't let this go by without retaliating. We need to do something, and then Russians retaliating. The question is whether this is a war crime. If you are hitting civilian infrastructure purposefully, which is going to cause, you know, death and suffering to civilians, okay, instead of hitting military infrastructure, and possibly Putin might be hiding behind the fact that this is just a special military operation, it's not war. But you know, this is there's still, you know, very debatable tactics. Now, if we go, so this is where we were before. This is the Oskil River, Izium, Kupiansk, Borova, and if we go further north, we have the Russian border. Okay, and this is Valyuky. This is where a base has been destroyed. Now, this is incredibly kind of unfair. Of course, it's unfair. It's war, and it's Russia, and it's Putin, and they're imperialistic. It's unfair because you can't hide behind in your own territory, bomb the civilian infrastructure of Kharkiv, right? There's taken relentless missile attacks from within Russia, hitting loads of settlements, but particularly Kharkiv. And then as soon as the Ukrainians hit back, Russia say, you can't do that. We're going to attack your civilian infrastructure now. We're going to hit your dams and your electricity. As if, you know, they haven't just been involved in an invasion into Ukraine for, you know, however 6-7 months, and haven't been absolutely hammering civilian infrastructure themselves. The Ukrainians are careful to hit actual bases here, right? Military installations and equipment. So I don't know. This is Russia obviously being, you know, Russia, and saying things that you know, don't hold up. But there you go. If we move down to Kherson, again, we have similar news from before, although it does look like if you go to the War Mapper map, we have um, a definite increase on the pink in this area with some yellow to show that Ukraine have made these have succeeded in taking territory in Kherson. But we go back to the ISW map. It looks pretty similar to how it did yesterday. The other thing to note in Kherson is within the city of Kherson itself. Actually, I'll come to that in a second. So just before that, it's worth noting the ISW says Ukrainian government and local sources reported mounting Russian casualties and the deployment of low-quality Russian units along the Kherson front. And of course, without being able to get supplies and reinforcements in there with any ease, I think there are helicopter sorties going in to drop off supplies to that area because they can't get there by bridge or by boat because the Ukrainians have taken them out. So they're relying on helicopters, and of course you just can't get the amount of stuff, and it's a bit risky. But the reports are that the Russian casualties are mounting, and now they're getting sort of much lower quality troops along that Kherson front. But the big thing that's going on in Kherson is that both collaborators are doing stuff, killing people or setting off bombs, and there have always been these sort of car bombs and stuff going off. But Ukrainian forces, and this was thought originally, I think, to be collaborators, but it looks like it might have actually been a HIMARS strike. Now, HIMARS are particularly precise, and obviously the intelligence is good in Kherson, as in there are a lot of pro-Ukrainians saying, well, this is where the Russians are, this is what they're doing. So Ukrainian forces struck Russia's occupation headquarters in Kherson, likely using HIMARS on September the 16th. Local social media reported that 5 Ukrainian rockets struck the Kherson Administrative Court building, which houses Russia's occupation administration, and depicted heavy damage. So there was it happened during a meeting. So this didn't just happen any old time. There was a meeting going on, and some of the administrative leaders have been killed and injured. So Kherson Oblast Deputy Occupation Head Kirill Stremusov and several Russian military bloggers reported that Ukraine used HIMARS to conduct the strike rather than being collaborators planting bombs inside, which was, I think, the original theory. So it's been confirmed that Ukrainian forces struck Russian occupation authorities on September the 16th and destroyed a Rosgvardia base in the city centre. So that was Rosgvardia are the sort of Russian military police that they brought a lot of in to try and clear up the mess after the initial invasion, thinking it would be a 2 to 3 day job, and then these Rosgvardia will go and sort of calm everything down and sort everything out. Anyway, they've just been roped into doing quite a lot of work in the ensuing 6 months as far as actual military work, and they've also been hit badly. But it looks like one of their bases has been taken out in Kherson. And what this has meant is that Ukraine are now warning civilians in occupied Kherson to stay away from Russian positions. It is dangerous to be a Russian in Kherson because now they are happy and willing to hit places in Kherson with precise munitions. And you've got to be, I think that this is a case up and down the front line, is I would be scared if I was in a Russian base. With HIMARS operating all over the shop, you just wouldn't want to collect people together. So when HIMARS first came out, they were hitting some of these major command and controls sort of bases, taking out loads of officers and people with intelligence. I mean that in the military sense. And I would imagine that Russia have adapted to not collecting so many, command people in positions of command together in one place, because you'd just be super worried that you're going to be hit at any time. but there you go. So that's what's happening in the Kherson region. There are an awful lot of partisan activities taking place all over the shop. Melitopol, which is one of the few, is only really Melitopol, Kherson, and eventually Mariupol. But Melitopol fell quite early. But that has seen a lot of explosions taking place, both I think from rockets, but also quite a bit of partisan activity. People are just on the edge of their seats in these major areas because they don't know where the Ukrainians are going to hit next. They don't know quite what the Ukrainians are going to do, as I've been saying, because I don't know quite what they're going to do. Are they going to hit Mariupol? Are they going to try and do a pincer movement around Donetsk? Are they going to, be concerned a lot with the Luhansk region up here? Moving into Luhansk, what are they going to do? Is it going to be Kherson and Crimea, or even through down to Melitopol? There are so many options, and I guess the Russians are going to be worrying as to which one of those options they are going to take. What is worth noting is that, and this has come from Jens Stoltenberg, who's NATO, as well as the exiled governor of Luhansk, is that the move into this Luhansk region will be a lot slower. It won't be the lightning advance that you've seen. There is recognition that, okay, that was great, but now, this is going to be a slow attritional stage of warfare, rather like we see down in Kherson. So that's worth noting. Okay, I'm going to play you a bit of a clip from a really good podcast I listen to every single weekday. It's fantastic. It's from the Telegraph, Daily Telegraph. I'm not a huge fan of that politically, but the Ukraine, the latest podcast is fantastic. I do advise that. And this is a little snippet from Roland Oliphant. I've put it on 1.25 times speed, so it's a little bit quicker. But this will be relevant for any liberated area that the Ukrainians, take over, and where there are citizens who have lived under Russian occupation for some time, where the internet has been blocked, where they don't have information about what's going on, and they don't know what Ukraine are doing, and they don't know if and when Ukraine will come to liberate them, if at all. So this is a fascinating insight, really worth listening to. So I'll play this segment.
The other big thing that I really noticed, which Sergio was talking about in his conversations with people there was a slight hesitance to speak. Not too many civilians on the street. Those who did emerge, elderly, looking for some aid, a certain wariness of speaking to journalists. Which I think is understandable when suddenly the town you're living in changes hands. You've been living under occupation for 6 months. The Russians have told you they're here forever. And then suddenly a new army comes in, and it might be your army. You might be quite pleased to see them, but it is men with guns. And they came in very suddenly. And what if the other guys come back, and what the hell is going on? And everybody he's spoken to has talked about this intense wave of fear during the battle to retake it. It was a brief battle, but my God, it's scary when shells are coming in. So a degree of trauma. And the most interesting, I think this is an important thing that especially maybe the Ukrainian government wants to paper over. So he talked to a guy. He was a pro-Ukrainian. He said he was arrested for destroying some Russian ammunition in his own tiny little partisan action. But he said, look, when the Russians came in March, about 2/3 of the population of the town left. Of those who stayed, his guess was about half of them had some kind of Russian sympathy. And he said, I'm not calling them collaborators, but they just, they drank in the propaganda. They began to believe the propaganda about the Russian world. This is a Russian-speaking area, quite close to the border, lots of connections back and forth. Internet was cut off. There was no Ukrainian radio or television, so all you're getting was the Russian line. No one knew if Ukraine was going to come back. So, people believed in Ukraine, but they were slowly losing hope. And I think that is a nuance that is quite important. And it's going to be a challenge for the Ukrainians dealing with this as they retake towns, especially as they go further east. Because when you're under occupation, people make compromises. And I think there's probably a wariness about people who were living under occupation. Are they going to say I'm a collaborator? It's one of those nuanced grey areas of war, which I think we should keep an eye on.
Thanks, Roland. And
so I thought that was fascinating. I think that's really worth taking on board. So as you get the Ukrainians moving further and further east, particularly up north, in this area, you're going to have a lot of people who the leftover people, are they going to be pro-Russian? And if they are pro-Ukrainian, they've been under occupation for 6 months and they don't really know what's going on. And they're going to be really wary. And where do their loyalties lie? Have they been brainwashed by Russian propaganda, which might be an inevitability for some, and so it's difficult to think. Well, we can't. You don't want to blame them for thinking those things because they are the victim of outright propaganda. I think that's particularly interesting insight. That's a very good podcast, and I would advise listeners to check it out on a daily basis. Another thing I want to talk about, or I'm going to get someone else to talk about it, regards the pundit that I played, or a couple of the pundits, on a political television show, Russian television show. And I've done a couple of them. And I talked about how there are alternative views that are being voiced in Russia that you wouldn't have seen 6 months ago. And I said that's really interesting. It shows that actually it reflects some discontent within certain circles. Vlad Vexler, who's a really good YouTuber, he's a philosopher, not living in Russia, I believe, but Russian, and comments on a lot of stuff to do with Russia. He has his 2 channels. This is coming from his Vlad Vexler chat channel. And this is where he disagrees with what I say. So take on board this, and he's probably right. He knows a lot more than I do, but worth taking into account alternative viewpoints. And he talks about how this wouldn't have just been an alternative viewpoint and allowed to be voiced, that actually this would be part of an agenda. And he talks about saturating the information environment. We'll just talk about that briefly. Again, this is on 1.25 times speed. So if you're listening to me on extra speed, so to speak, then this guy's going to be super quick.
And the Western media's reporting on this discourse of mobilization as it's appeared in Russia has been very good in little slivers, little pockets of high quality journalism, but the majority of it has been really poor. So if you're just randomly following major journalistic institutions, you are sadly going to be misinformed. There is a guy who seems to be everywhere. You would have seen him in videos of your favorite YouTubers, in the papers, on TV, called Boris Nadezhdin. And he's a guy who said on a Russian propaganda show that it's time to negotiate and look at a peace deal. And if we're not going to do that, we should at least do mobilization. And that's a kind of rumbling of discontent that the Western media has reported on, right? Wrong. It's not remotely a rumbling of discontent. There are rumblings of discontent, but that's not one of them. So what is that? What is going on? Well, as we said a few months ago in our propaganda video on the main channel, which I think is called the Postmodern Hell of Russian Propaganda, the Russian regime is a big fan of saturating the informational environment with a series of incompatible messages for their benefit. That's what they're doing. They are saturating the informational environment with a series of incompatible messages about mobilization. And after, they're going to see what they can gather about this. They're going to poll the people. They're going to send out a few tasters and feelers here, and they're going to see where the public seems to them to be at on this. And when Zyuganov, the quote-unquote leading communist politician, quote-unquote communist because the Communist Party in Russia is just kind of artificial opposition party that's in fact a sort of government department, really. But Gennady Zyuganov has said that it's time to think of the war as a war and take it a great deal more seriously, which borders on being a criminal offense in Russia. Of course, he didn't say it because That's where the spirit took him. He said it because there's an agenda there. It's not necessarily an agenda coming from the very top, but it's an agenda coming from somewhere. And the idea is that there's going to be this sort of saturation of the informational environment. So these are not rumblings of discontent that Western journalistic publications are pointing at, despite what you can read. They are a campaign of sort of, saturation of the information environment. And that's going to be used for the regime to get a better feel of what's really going on, where the population are really at. So that's the propaganda.
Okay, and that's very interesting. I'd advise you go and watch the rest of that. What that really says is that that what I was one of the people saying, look, these are genuine rumblings of discontent. He's saying, no, they're not. They're just putting all these different voices out there, and they try and gauge public opinion by doing that. And there you go. So it is all part of a larger agenda. Worth thinking about as to what the truth is there. It would be surprising that people can get away with saying these things and not get arrested, and yet other people who say these things online and what have you are arrested. So that does sort of lead into believing that maybe Vexler is correct here and I'm wrong. But there you go. It's up to you to make up your own conclusions as to what you think is going on. Okay, and just a couple more things to say before I wrap this up. I am going to do something over the next day or two with regard to what all these acronyms stand for. BTG, Battalion Tactical Group. What is a battalion? What's a company? What's a unit? What's a regiment? All these terms that get thrown about. Then you've got APCs, IFVs, BMPs, MLTBs, or is that NTLBs? So many of these acronyms floating around. What do they all mean? How do they fit together? And what does that look like for a Russian force? So I think that would be quite helpful. I'm no expert, so I'll be learning along with you, I'm sure. But what I want to mention just now, a couple of interesting things. First of all, this is from Shashank Joshi. He says, interesting statement from Russia on satellite use. Quote, quasi-civilian infrastructure may become a legitimate target for retaliation. Close quote. It's clear that Starlink has become an important part of Ukraine's command control and communication system in parts of the country. So Starlink is a satellite system that Elon Musk owns and has been using and helping Ukraine with. They've had Starlink satellite systems on the ground, satellite sort of communications equipment, and it has been invaluable for Ukraine to do the job that they've done in defending their sovereign country. Russia is now saying, well, this is basically effectively being used militarily, so we can hit them. Whoa, this is pretty startling. So if you're going to start getting satellite warfare, if you start getting Russians taking out satellites, how are they going to do that? Is this technology? Is this sort of in terms of software, or is this in terms of hardware that this will happen? It's pretty interesting stuff. So have a watch out for that and see if that turns up again in the news, because that could change how we do war. The next thing to mention, now I talked about how the Shanghai Cooperation Organization met in Uzbekistan, and you had Putin talking with China, Xi Jinping, and China being a little bit cool in the way that they supported Russia and the war, which said a lot. Well, here we've now got in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi told Russian President Vladimir Putin on Friday that now was not the time for war, directly assailing the Kremlin chief in public over the nearly 7-month-long conflict in Ukraine. Wow. So this is India, who have been, again, not outright supporting Russia, but not going against them, being happy to get cheap oil off them and things like, economically speaking, they aren't grumbling too much about how the war is taking place. And yet here Modi has come out and publicly said this. So this is CNBC reporting. India Prime Minister Modi tells Russia's Putin that now is not an era for war. So Indian Prime Minister Modi on Friday told Russian President Vladimir Putin that now is not the time for war, with food, fertilizer and fuel security among the major concerns of the world at present. Quote, I know that today's era is not an era of war, and I've spoken to you on the phone about this, Modi told Putin in the sidelines of a regional security bloc summit in Uzbekistan, adding that democracy, diplomacy and dialogue keep the world together. Putin said that he understood Modi's concerns about the Ukraine war. Quote, I know about your position on the conflict in Ukraine, and I know about your concerns. We want all of this to end as soon as possible. Yeah, well, do you know what? The easiest way for it to end as soon as possible is to get out of there. You know, it's not your country. Go away. But that's not going to happen. And we can talk. I'll talk in a future video about the options for Putin, actually. But that's really, really interesting, and is quite surprising that Modi's come out and said that, actually. And I'm pretty happy he's done so. And finally, concerning that, so that's been a meeting in Uzbekistan, right? So Uzbekistan is here. We've got Ukraine over here. Problems with Armenia and Azerbaijan. And interestingly, Russia has been the peacekeeper around here, but not always in a sense of we might think it, such that whoever Russia defend are the bad guys. But there are opportunistic movements going on. So I talked about how there was border troubles between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Well, Russia were broadly supporting Armenia because Azerbaijan were the aggressors. It's going to be complicated and nuanced. What's interesting is in the absence of Russia, you've had actually Nancy Pelosi going to Armenia for talks over there. So that's not to say that Russia were necessarily doing sort of bad things and supporting the wrong people over here. But in their absence, when an empire crumbles, blood will spill. And in a sense, the empire is crumbling here, arguably, in terms of Russia's influence, or at least very momentarily, their influence is being sucked away by concern for Ukraine and in Ukraine. And there will be opportunistic movements going on everywhere else. You've also got the idea, and Russian people apparently themselves are quite worried about this, about Russia receding in terms of power, and you can see this because of their failure in Ukraine, and therefore China stepping up. So this has been going on for decades. 50 years ago, it was all about Russia, not about China. Now it's all about China, not about Russia. So Russia is arguably a vassal state of China, and China is the one that's pulling the strings, and we can see that as an issue that's growing more and more prevalent as the weeks and months go by, and as Moscow and the Kremlin lose power, as they have done on this calamitous invasion of Ukraine that's just really not worked in their favor at all. Well, anyway, they're meeting in Uzbekistan at the moment. And I told you about this meeting in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There's issues going on in Azerbaijan and Armenia, and there's been border issues going on with Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Well, it turns out that those border skirmishes have turned into outright shelling, and almost 30 people have been reported dead in clashes between the Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan forces. Now, this comes as well as we find out that up to 1,500 Russian troops were redeployed to Ukraine from a Tajik base, an investigation reveals. So you have these really opportunistic movements from and decisions from forces in these Asian countries, Eurasian countries, that are as a result of Moscow's attention being directed elsewhere. And it's fascinating. It's one to look out for, to see how Russia will react, if they react at all, and who will pick up the pieces, if anyone. Or do these fights end up being, long-running conflicts that go on because there are no peacekeeping forces to help out. I don't know, but it's very interesting indeed. So as I say, the next video will probably include something to do with discussing how military units are constructed and what battalion tactical groups are, because that's what we talk about in terms of Russia's invasion. And we talk about, oh, they've got this many BTGs over in Ukraine and this many in the Kharkiv area. 30 BTGs over in the Kharkiv area. There should have been. Well, okay, what does that mean? What's that made up of? So I'll talk a bit about that in the next video. But in the meantime, thanks so much for still watching my daily updates. I really do appreciate it. Any help will be gratefully received in terms of thanks, joining the channel, or indeed just liking, subscribing, and sharing. All of that's really, really appreciated. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, goodbye.